If you look at the polls in Europe, and I'm sure you've looked at polling data, there's no popular support in Europe for a war with Russia. But if Merz, who is now boasting about his readiness to help the Ukrainians launch missiles into Russia's heartland and destroy people in Moscow, is serious, I think he should be prepared for Russian missiles to land on German soil. Right now, Mr. Netanyahu, the prime minister, enjoys far more influence on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. than Donald Trump does. I think the probable outcome right now is that the Israelis will find a way to start the war with Iran. Everything you hear in the West is bullshit. We're on the verge of a financial collapse, Paul.
Hi everybody, Paul Buitink here for Reinvent Money, a podcast about money and power. Today I welcome back Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Welcome, Colonel. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, let's first talk about Ukraine, because things seem to be moving fast there. Trump says that the Ukraine war is not his war, yet he is still funding it and sending weapons. And at the same time, he says Putin has gone crazy, and there's even talks that he wants to impose more sanctions. So what do you think, Colonel, will be the next move of Trump? What will be Americans' position towards the conflict going into the summer?
Well, if you're sitting in Moscow, you have concluded, I think accurately, that President Trump really isn't not in charge of anything. He doesn't seem to be much of an improvement over Biden, who was never in charge of anything. So I think the Russians have simply concluded they've got to end this war in their own terms with their own means. And at the same time, they're also watching as the European leaders, people like Merz, as well as Macron and Starmer, are taking very strident anti-Russian positions, announcing, the lifting of any restrictions on the use of missiles, specifically to Taurus, with a 300-mile range or 500-kilometer range that conceivably could hit Moscow, and saying, well, this is fine. We're 100% behind this sort of thing. In other words, Trump has no control at home because the Senate is really going to do pretty much whatever it wants, whether President Trump likes it or not. And second, President Trump's comments are almost incoherent and absurd. This notion that somehow or another Putin is this bloodthirsty monster all of a sudden that's attacking civilian targets. The opposite is the case. If anybody has been attacking hospitals and civilian targets, it's the Ukrainians, not the Russians. And what's even worse is that recently the Ukrainians, undoubtedly with help from the CIA, identified that President Putin was leaving Moscow to fly to Kursk in a helicopter and was able to attack the helicopter with various long-range drones. So, clearly Trump's not in charge of anything, and I think that's what the Moscow has rightly concluded. Now, what will Trump do? I think he'll just talk because it's obvious that the CIA and other powerful figures behind the scenes are running U.S. foreign and defense policy. That's the truth. And he has no influence whatsoever over the leadership in NATO or Europe. They seem to be on autopilot, responding to the same people that the CIA is responding to. So it's a very bad situation. But the Russians, they don't want a war with us. And that has been really the guiding principle from day one, is to avoid a war with the United States and NATO. They will continue to do that. But they're not going to pay much attention to anything that we say, and I suspect they will escalate and ultimately win this war on their own terms.
I was triggered by what you said earlier, that most of, or even all of the civilian targets were actually hit by Ukraine. Is that then interception rockets aimed at the missiles coming in, or are you saying the Russians are not hitting any of the civilian targets, even by mistake?
No, the Russians aren't making any mistakes. If they strike something which is technically called civilian, is because the Ukrainian military has occupied it. And this has been a problem from the very beginning. As soon as they went into the place, they discovered the Ukrainians would set up anti-tank missiles and anti-tank guns on the first and second floors of hospitals, sometimes on top floors. That leaves them no choice. If that's the case, they have to destroy the weapon system that's killing their people. then they get clearance to attack the building, regardless of what its civilian use is. But there's always been this utterly false narrative that the Russian military was just like the Soviet military. It isn't. And they keep proselytizing to everyone who will listen that today's Russia is like the Soviet Union. It's not. So you get very tired of listening to this nonsense, but it goes on and on and on. And right now, if you look at the polls in Europe, and I'm sure you've looked at polling data, there's no popular support in Europe for a war with Russia. No. But the governments act as though that's exactly what they want. It's catastrophic.
Yeah, we need to address the European side here too. With one more question or a few more about American positions. So you're saying Trump is really not in charge at all when it comes to the American support here. But do you think Congress and the CIA, they want to continue funding the war then, regardless of Trump things?
Yeah. Yeah, they're committed to perpetual war, both in Eastern Europe as well as in the Middle East. So the warmongering lobby, the war lobby, if you will, dominates inside the Beltway and on the Hill and in the Central Intelligence Agency and to a large extent in the Department of Defense. Though the Department of Defense is a little different because ultimately they have real skin in the game. The people you're talking about on the Hill, they have no skin in the game. They're not going to show up and fight. Neither will their children or their relatives. So they could care less. But the people in the Department of Defense, that's a somewhat different group because they do face the consequences of these decisions if we push too far. And I think we continue to push too far.
Yeah. So in that sense, Trump is just not a puppet like his predecessors.
Yeah, it looks that way. I don't see him doing much of anything that is really fundamentally different. Now, he's talked a great game about the border. And the border, from an optical standpoint, it looks better. And we're not seeing massive millions of people, to invade the country as we did. But the human trafficking and the drug trafficking continue because they're moving through the legal crossing points because the customs officers and police at the legal crossing points are largely paid off by the drug cartels to let these things go through. At the same time, you had the huge trucks full of cash, the profits from the drug cartels in the United States, as well as sometimes people moving through these legal crossing points. These things haven't stopped. So when I say optics, I'm talking about the appearance is better, but in truth, the fundamental problem remains. And I haven't seen any real willingness to attack it.
Yeah, and under Trump, at least, arms support, military aid has been less to Ukraine than under Biden. But do you think they will ramp it up then, that more will be shipped in? Or does the U.S. simply not have the weapons available for Ukraine?
Well, that may be true, although I don't know what the actual numbers are, but I think that our stocks are clearly quite low. There's no question about that. But the wasteful cash that goes over there is still going to move in that direction. I think what we have to expect is the following. Donald Trump is now making comments about Russia and the war that are diametrically opposed to what he said 60, 90 days ago. In other words, he's done a complete about turn. Why? Why would he do that? And I think it's because he's confronted with a situation that he doesn't think he can change. And so he's justifying his inaction by making these foolish and stupid statements publicly. I think we're going to see the same thing in the Middle East. He never brings up Gaza. And when he does, he either talks about its real estate value or says, oh, yes, we really need to do something for those people, changes the subject and walks away. So we have a similar set of phenomena in both the Middle East and in Eastern Europe. So I think the Europeans are going to have to take control of their own destiny. They've got to get rid of these governments that are currently in power because we're not going to help them because Trump's not going to do anything for them. And at the same time, remember, we're on the verge of a financial collapse, Paul.
Yeah, for sure.
All you have to do is look at the bond market.
Yeah.
And the 10-year bond is always the bellwether. And those interest rates keep rising despite the efforts of the Federal Reserve to suppress interest rates. Well, they've lost control. They don't have control. And when this percentage reaches 5% in the bond market, and it's going to. The yields are going up while the prices go down. We're finished. We can't service the debt. Everything collapses.
Yeah, I honestly think that Trump, first of all, really hates war. So he's been genuine about that. And he also understands that the US debt is not sustainable. But it doesn't really matter who you put in his position, whether it's Einstein or Santa Claus or Trump. No one can fix the debt problem.
Oh, no.
It requires massive spending cuts and probably even default. And Trump is not going to do that.
Well, the interesting thing is when he came in, he had the opportunity to take the stringent measures, that is, cut the defense budget by about 50%, and then begin to go after entitlements. The Social Security business is bankrupt. So what do? Well, you can turn around and say everyone over the age of 60 gets Social Security. Everyone under the age of 60, you're not going to see it. We're going to have to formulate a different approach. We'll have to build a different structure. He could have done those things, but he's unwilling to step up to the plate and do what takes real character and real brains. Instead, he's doubled down on failed policies. So I think we're going to go over the cliff. So frankly, anything he says at this point, particularly about military power in the Middle East or Eastern Europe or Asia for that matter, is just nonsense.
It's incoherent ranting, yeah. And so the Russians will just do what the Russians will do, and they will continue their advance. And it seems like the front line is sort of collapsing, although we've basically have said that over the years. But it seems things are moving faster now. Also, the amount of rockets and drones being fired at Ukraine is going up. So if that happens and the front line collapses, that could also, of course, lead to huge migration flows to the west of Europe. And that's also not a favorable outcome for Europe. So I guess there's a geopolitical interest for Europeans to try to support Ukraine as much as possible to avoid that from happening.
Well, let's put it this way. If you live in Poland, you want to get rid of the Ukrainians that are living in your country. They've got more than 3 million of them. Feelings in Romania, Hungary, Slovakia are very similar. I think they are in Germany. People want these Ukrainians to go home. Now, let's link that to what's actually happening in Ukraine right now. For the first time, we have a lot of tangible, concrete evidence that there are huge numbers of young men organizing themselves inside Ukraine to resist any further compulsory military service. In other words, you show up with your gang of thugs, you get out of your little van and you go onto the sidewalk to pick somebody up. Suddenly, you're no longer dealing with one person. You're dealing with 10 or 15, many of whom have guns and are not going to surrender these people anymore to the Ukrainian state. The truth is that Zelensky is about as popular as AIDS inside Ukraine. People are sick of the war. They're sick of him. I think Zelensky's nightmare is that this war will end, whether he likes it or not, on Russian terms. These Ukrainian soldiers will return home. And what are they going to do? They're going to come looking for Zelensky, the man who's responsible for killing over 1.5 million Ukrainian soldiers in a pointless war that never made any sense.
Is it 1.5 million, right? Because if I look at a number of Russian casualties, sort of safe to say like 120,000. And if I look at Ukrainian casualties, if I look at different sources, they have a range of between 100 and 150,000. But you say it's 10 times as much. What's your main source for this number?
Russian, Polish, and Ukrainian. People on the ground talking to me. I mean, I was telling people a couple of years ago that the hospitals in Ukraine were packed to the maximum extent possible, that people were bleeding to death in the holes. Massive numbers of amputees. A man was talking to me on a cell phone through another man in Poland who was giving me the information. If you don't talk to the people on the ground, if you don't have some real contact with somebody who's in a position to tell you the truth, everything you hear in the West is bullshit. Forget it. They're just lies. Now, we think that the Russians have lost probably 120 to 130,000 dead. Now, that's not all Russian. Remember, you've had a lot of people fight in this war from Chechnya and elsewhere, but these are all Russian troops. Some of them are from Luhansk and Donetsk, as well as from Russia itself. That's about right. In other words, if you look at the ratio, which 2 years ago was 1 to 6, for every one Russian killed, there were 6 Ukrainians. That ratio has now risen to above 10. Now, why would that be the case? Because when armies are falling apart, when they can no longer resist effectively and they begin retreating and withdrawing, that's when the heavy casualties are sustained.
Like in Germany, Second World War.
Exactly. Most of the serious casualties taken by the Germans happened in the last 9 months of the war. Germans didn't take very heavy casualties until that point. And that's what people don't understand. The same thing was true in the American Civil War with the Confederates. They began falling apart, and as they fell apart, they sustained very heavy casualties. Ukraine is finished as a state. I don't know what replaces it. I don't know how that will sort out. But if you're a Russian, you are not going to tolerate any regime in Kyiv or anywhere else inside Ukraine that looks like the regime that's there now, running around with all these ridiculous Nazi symbols that murder people, their own and others. I mean, go all the way back to this Bucha. I don't know if you remember that or not, but that was an absolutely staged atrocity. The people there were murdered, not by Russians, but by Ukrainians and their mercenaries.
But the satellite images show that the bodies were there already when the Russians were there. So, yeah. The argument that the Russians made that these bodies were put there after the Russians left, that doesn't match with satellite images.
That I'm unaware of. All I know is the Russians didn't do it.
And going back to the migrants, then, if the Russians make it all the way to the Dnieper, isn't there a risk that migrants, that Ukrainians in those oblasts, the ones that are more oriented to the west and to Kyiv, will actually then flee and go to the rest of Europe? And wouldn't that lead to some conflict? Because most of these countries are not per se welcoming that prospect.
You mean the Dutch army is going to take to the field to fight the Russians?
No, but it will lead to a migration flow, right? It's going to for sure. No.
Wait a minute. You said something else. You said the migration flow would lead to a war.
No, more like it will lead to. We already have so many problems with migration in Europe, and then you will have a few more millions of Ukrainians leaving those oblasts to find a better life in the west of Europe, possibly.
I suggest that you do something. It's called defend your borders.
Right.
I think the Poles will do that. No doubt in my mind. I think the Slovaks and the Hungarians will do that. Moving into Romania means you have to go through Moldova. I don't know how that works out. I don't know how many of these people will flee that far west. Many of them may simply cross the Dnieper River, which from a Russian standpoint is, thank God, get out of here. They don't want to rule Ukrainians under any circumstances. They never have. This whole business of Russia wanting to conquer Ukraine is absurd. Russians know their own history. Putin knows it very well. No one in their right mind wants to go into Western Ukraine and try to rule it. That includes, by the way, the Poles, who ruled most of it for most of its history. So the bottom line is you've got to defend your borders. We have to do it. You have to do it. If you don't do it, then you are responsible for your own disaster, to be perfectly blunt.
Yeah. So, and how much time you think the Russians will need then to achieve their objectives, given that the aid from the U.S. is at least uncertain, and most likely the U.S. doesn't even have the weapons to provide, and the Europeans, of course, are also. Especially not being able to give more Patriots and some of these intercepting missiles that Ukraine desperately needs. So how much time do you think the Russians still need then?
The Russians have won this war. That's not open to debate. The question is, what are the conditions at the end? In other words, what does the end state look like? The Russians know what they don't want. They don't want Zelensky and the neo-Nazis in charge. That's very clear. And the Russians have now learned that the governments in Western Europe are incurable. In other words, they are not going to change their views. I think Putin has waited with a great deal of patience for the European electorates to remove these people from power. But if Merz, who is now boasting about his readiness to help the Ukrainians launch missiles into Russia's heartland and destroy people in Moscow, is serious, I think he should be prepared for Russian missiles to land on German soil.
Right.
That's coming.
Yeah.
If he doesn't stop this nonsense, that will happen.
Yeah, so you're talking about Kinzhal rockets being sent to targets in Germany.
Remember that the Russian Kinzhal missile, they have multiple missiles, but that one in particular, they can reach every potential military target in Europe, essentially from the Arctic Circle in Norway all the way down to southern Portugal. There's nothing they can't reach and attack if they decide to do it. And that's not with nuclear warheads, that's with conventional warheads. Obviously, if somebody uses a nuclear weapon against them, they can refit those missiles with nuclear warheads. But right now, that's absolutely off the table. Putin has made that very clear. Unless they are attacked, there will be no use of nuclear weapons. But my point is that the German people need to wake up. Everybody in Europe needs to wake up. This is not the Soviet Union. This is not a war of conquest led by Stalin. This is a defensive war waged by the Russians in eastern Ukraine against a neo-Nazi regime that we helped to set up in 2014, that after 2014 killed some 14,000 people in Donetsk and Luhansk. The Russians finally have had enough. They're not going to put up with any more oppression of Russians or the destruction of Russian life and property.
How do you find the neo-Nazi regime then? Because, of course, Zelensky is a Jew. Are there many, because we know the Azov regiment, of course, that's a relatively small pocket. So how could you elaborate? How does it, how is it so then that it's a Nazi regime, in your words?
Hey, listen, I think you've just raised an important point. He is Jewish. Much of his inner circle is Jewish. His predecessors in power were Jewish. Poroshenko was Jewish. You can go through, Yeltsin was a Jew, by the way. They changed their names. So that's a very interesting question. I think that he was selected by many of the same people that have selected leaders in Western Europe in order to lead this campaign against Russia. Remember, he was, a comedian, an actor of some sort, picked by another Jewish oligarch to go lead the charge. But I think they always understood that because of the World War II experience, whatever you could do to summon up the picture of the Soviet juggernaut coming for them was seen as positive. And secondly, what nobody seems to understand about the Second World War is that if you lived in Eastern Europe, you had one of two choices. You could fight with the Soviets and communism, or you could join the Wehrmacht. Okay, millions joined the Wehrmacht, not just in Ukraine, but all across Eastern Europe and for that matter in Central Europe. Don't get me started talking about the Dutch or the Norwegians or the Danes. For every one person that was supposedly in the so-called resistance, 3 were volunteers in the Wehrmacht or the Waffen-SS. We don't understand the Second World War. We don't understand how that was fought and why people did what they did. But I think the people like Zelensky and his backers understood that these symbols were very useful from the standpoint of mobilizing Ukrainians to fight against what they thought was another Soviet-like enemy. Now, these symbols are depraved and should have been cast aside early on. That hasn't been the case. They're still operating. I always felt strongly that anybody in Western Europe should have said, and in the United States for that matter, before we send you 10 cents in aid, get rid of all these symbols. But we haven't done that. And I don't see that happening anytime soon. And that's the problem that Lavrov and Putin have. That cannot exist on Russia's borders. Any organization, any government that tolerates that or identifies with it or pushes it for mobilization is unacceptable.
Right. Okay, let's move then to the Middle East. What's your outlook on the conflict between Hamas and Israel? Because previous time we talked about Israel's desire for a greater Israel. Are they still on track to accomplish that, or you think they're going to fail in their attempt?
I think the Israelis are committed to Project Greater Israel. And that involves the elimination of the Arab population or the Palestinian population, whether it is Muslim or Christian, makes no difference, in both Gaza and the West Bank. That's their goal. And they want to subjugate their neighbors. They want to bully their neighbors into submission. And they're going to continue that as long as the United States continues to provide unconditional support. Right now, President or Mr. Netanyahu, the prime minister, enjoys far, far more influence on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. than Donald Trump does. And if you watch the way Donald Trump behaves, as soon as he's walked up to the cliff and said either you jump or you don't, he prefers not to jump, which means that he's not going to contradict the Israelis. Large sums of money were spent to put him in office by the supporters of the Israel lobby inside the United States. That's the fact. I don't see that changing. And if you look at the people in his administration, what have they all done? They've all made trips to Israel and bent the knee. I was surprised moderately to see Kristi Noem, who is the leader of the Department of Homeland Security, praying at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem.
Yeah, but then Trump not going to Netanyahu in his Middle East trip is just then not significant. It's just a sideshow.
I would not pay any attention to the allegations that there's some sort of great split. Everybody who has had to deal with Netanyahu dislikes the man intensely. That's not news, and I'm sure that applies to Donald. But the point is, Netanyahu is still in charge, not Donald. And that's what worries us a great deal. I think the probable outcome right now is that the Israelis will find a way to start the war with Iran. Whether that comes as a result of a direct attack by them on Iran or a false flag operation, some incident that is exploited to justify an assault on Iran, I don't know. But I think something along those lines is going to occur. And Netanyahu knows that with the support that he enjoys in the Senate and the House, that we will be compelled to join them.
Yeah, and Netanyahu needs that war basically because he's not succeeding in Gaza, and in order to stay in power, he needs to basically expand and get into a war with Iran.
You say he's not succeeding in Gaza. The man is bombing from whatever altitude, 5, 10, 15,000 feet, tents full of women and children in Gaza, and it hasn't hurt him a bit.
Well, internationally, of course, there's more and more outrage. Spain is stopping the provision of arms. So it seems like he's losing the international battle. And of course, he still has the US and other countries, but is that not a big problem for him?
I don't think so. I don't think he cares at all. His view is, let's get this thing over with. It's taken too long. And the United States continues to support him. So as long as he has the backing of the United States and he has unfettered access to our munitions and our weapon systems and so forth, he's not going to stop. The only thing that could stop him at this point is Iran. If he engages Iran and Iran strikes back, Iran will have an enormous impact on Israel. Let there be no mistake about it. At that point in time, the attitude inside the region may change. And I think he risks the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Turks, and others turning around and attacking him. It all depends on the level of damage that Iran inflicts. Once again, that's why he wants us involved. Why have people not already taken action against Israel? Very simple. The United States. The Egyptians, the rest of them, they'll contend with the Israeli military. And remember, they outnumber the Israelis. They'll sustain the losses. But it's not the Israelis they're worried about militarily. It's us. Nobody in any of these countries wants to be at war with the United States.
No, clear. And earlier, we already talked about the financial position of the U.S. To what extent can indeed this high debt load and the unsustainability of it harm America's army and geopolitical interest? Because do you really think it's likely that we will see a U.S. debt default, or what's the more likely scenario in your view when it comes to U.S. finances in the next few years?
Well, you know, we've had several defaults in our history. Franklin Roosevelt went through 2 defaults, one in 34 and then again in 36. But people characterized those as quote unquote restructuring the debt.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, he could do that because we still at the time had the largest manufacturing base in the world. We also had a huge skilled labor force. So if you're a creditor, in other words, you're somebody that the United States owes money, you knew that the United States would definitely recover from this depression, and that when it did, it would recover and be hugely powerful and wealthy and successful. We don't have that today. The largest manufacturing base in the world is in China, not the United States. And our skilled workforce has shrunk dramatically because, excuse me, we have effectively put them out of business by shipping the manufacturing base overseas. And our educational system is in ruins. It's just not productive. It doesn't prepare people for a place in the workforce. So, and then we have 50 plus million illegals we can't afford that we're subsidizing at great expense to the American people. So we're in a very different position. We had another default when Richard Nixon made the decision to come off the gold standard. And if you go back and look at that decision, that was supposed to be temporary.
Yeah.
Well, that didn't turn out to be the case, did it? So what do you do now? Can you go back to the gold standard? I don't think so. Not in the United States. I think Bitcoin offers a path forward, frankly. We'll see how that turns out. But I think you're talking about a fundamental change in the United States in the way we do business and the way we're organized. And I think you're going to end up with a Western Hemisphere as its own world. Then you're going to have Asia, Eurasia, and Europe. I think that's where we're headed.
And Europe will then not be part of the Western Hemisphere, or will Europe still be tied to the US?
Well, you're not in the Western Hemisphere. You're in the Eastern Hemisphere.
Yeah, okay, but given the fact that we have always been allies with the US, whether it's NATO or the US will just be standalone together with Canada and Mexico, perhaps, and indeed also South America, and Europe will be its own sphere of influence.
Well, you're going to have to think carefully about what it means to be allied to the United States. The world has changed. You asked something about warfare. Well, we haven't been able to ship millions of people overseas for decades. If there were a serious war in Europe, it's impossible now. Precision strike from the land, precision strike from submarines, these things, and unmanned submersibles, as well as unmanned aircraft. Yeah. All of these things make another Normandy impossible. It's not going to happen. So this is something to Donald Trump's credit during his first term that he kept talking about. He was right. The Europeans have to become their own first responders. Now, the second thing is the Europeans are going to have to determine whether or not they want to continue on the suicidal path they're on, or recognize that they have been fighting the wrong people for the wrong reasons. And I'm talking about the Russians. The Russians are not some sort of existential threat to Europe at all. What the Russians want to do is business with Europe. And if you have a brain in your head in Germany right now, you want to do business with the Russians. And that's not new. Yeah. If you go back over the last 300, 350, 400 years, the Germans, with the exception of 2 world wars, have done a land office business with the Russians. They have a symbiotic relationship. All of this sort of suicidal deindustrialization in Germany is self-inflicted.
Yeah, we also talked about how Europe should think about breaking up in more homogeneous, smaller blocks. Right? There's just totally different interests.
Listen. When I served over there, the thing that I always thought was interesting is we used to talk at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe about the Roman line. Well, where did the Roman line run? Well, it ran around the French in Belgium, down along the French border, around Austria and Switzerland, down to Italy. And, if you went and asked an officer from one of the armed forces who lived west of the Roman line, you usually got what we called the Mediterranean shrug. If you say, well, do you think that the Italians or the French or the Spaniards could do X, Y, and Z? They would look at you and go. So what that meant was that the real burden of leadership fell on the so-called Germanic countries. All right. And we know who they are. And to a large extent on the British. The British loved that because they didn't spend much on their armed forces, but they could populate the headquarters with their officers. That's an old British game that's gone on for centuries as well. Use other people to fight your wars, but fund it.
Yeah.
Well, these things are realities. So if you're in Great Britain, what do you want to do? Do you want to become part of the continental mess? Or do you want to maintain your relationship with the United States and Canada? I think they'll maintain the relationship with the United States and Canada. I think so will Iceland. And frankly, if the Norwegians have a choice, they would do that as well.
Interesting.
The Norwegians don't want to be drawn into what happens on the continent either. So now you start to look at the things that we've talked about behind the scenes. What about a Nordic or Central East European security zone? You know, can the the people that will get along together are the Germans, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Finns, Swedes, potentially Danes, even Dutch, and Flemish. All right. Belgium is a perfect example of the ambiguity of European history. I mean, what the hell does that exist for? It's hard to believe anybody went to war over it in 1914. It's bizarre. And the whole time I served in Belgium, all the Flemish did was complain about how much money they sent every day down to the Walloons because there was nothing happening in Wallonia. Look, these are old problems. Everybody knows it, but nobody brings it up. Nobody mentions it.
But they will surface. They will surface again,
You get down to Austria, and as much as the Austrians and the Hungarians like to complain about each other, look at their thinking. It's very similar.
Yeah, but the language, of course, is different.
Yeah. Well, nobody understands Hungarian, but the Hungarians, like the Finns. But the point is that, these are old constructs that have always been there.
Yeah.
They're not going away. And the question is, are you going to admit to it and look for alternatives? Because you can sit in Rome or you can sit in Copenhagen and you don't see the same things. In other words, your perception of your security situation is very different. I remember when the euro was adopted, I happened to be in Vienna at the time, and I was down there for a meeting with the OSCE, and I'm sitting with all these various officers, and they were all, oh, this is wonderful. We are going to now all be together in Europe and everything else. And I said, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. That's no chance of success. The only people that agreed with me were the Russians. Everybody else, oh, no, you're wrong. Well, the problem is that monetary policy, financial policy in Germany and the Netherlands is radically different from what goes on in Italy and France.
Yeah, we should have never joined the euro as Holland. Unfortunately, I was too young to be aware at that point. But it's going to come back to haunt us, that decision. Well, thanks so much, Colonel, for this conversation. I think we covered quite some ground here.
Have I said enough incendiary things to keep your audience interested?
As long as you are honest, I'm happy. So no, it's always good to talk to you. And indeed, you are thought-provoking, and you probably heard a few people with the things you say, but it's coming from a good place, I think. And you want to contribute in the end, of course, when it comes to achieving peace, right? Because in the end, what's currently going on in the world is just awful in so many places.
Well, I think for all of us, the wars that we should be concerned about are not overseas or beyond our borders. They're the wars inside our borders. And whether or not we survive as nations, as people, with a true national identity and a body of laws that make sense for us will entirely depend on the outcome of the war we fight at home, not overseas.
Okay, well, that's a good words to end with, Colonel, and it would be nice to do it again in a few months.
Okay,
always.
Paul, good luck and thanks.
Yep. Have a good day, and talk to you next time.
Right, bye-bye.